Here we are on Mother's Day. Happy Mother's Day. You ready for this? So we're in this series. Most of you know, if you're a guest with us today, we're in a series going through the first 12 chapters of the book of Acts. We're starting in chapter 10 today, so we're drawing near. And it's kind of a pivotal passage today as we get into this chapter. It's a big step for us, especially toward the latter part of the chapter, which will be in the coming weeks. But I've noted this, and you recognize that just life on planet Earth has a particular ebb and flow to it. And one of the things that we, I hope, enjoy is that there is a effort-reward continuum, right? If we put forth the effort, then we can expect the rewards, right? That's kind of the way it is on earth. Not all the time, not every single time, but just in general, students who put in the hard work, who study diligently, they're rewarded in their report card. And maybe their capacity is to get A's, and so they would get A's. And other students, their capacity is to get C's, and they have labored, they have worked hard, and they get those C's. And both are to be congratulated. They put forth the effort, and they get the reward. Some of you are in sales, and salesmen and saleswomen, they make those hard phone calls, they go on those appointments, they do the follow-up, and they're rewarded with the commissions, right? Farmers, man, they diligently work their fields, and then they enjoy the bounty from their efforts, right? Athletes, they train diligently, just going for it, and then they stand on the podium. It's kind of the way things are here on planet Earth, right? We put forth the effort and we get the rewards. But you may have recognized that that's not always the case. I mean, think about the times when you have put forth your best effort and it wasn't good enough. And we're in a text this morning that really shows us some real truth to the way life is on planet Earth. So the effort-reward thing is really the way life is on planet Earth in some ways. But our text will show us today that, man, sometimes good isn't good enough. Right? And so let's get into this. You ready? Acts chapter 10. We're introduced to a man whose name is Cornelius. Now, that happens to be one of my very favorite names. Cornelius? Like, how could that not be your favorite name? Allison is down here laughing because she's got 3 boys, wife of Michael Anderson, and yes, we do pray for you, Allison, for many, many reasons. But Allison knows that I have tried for years. Like, I've even pressured people, tried to influence them, even put undue influence on them to name their children Cornelius because it's such a cool name. And all of the effort that I've put forth, I've not yet had one person reward me for my efforts and name their children Cornelius. I told Michael and Allison for their first son when he was in the womb, I said, it's Cornelius. That's his name. That's going to be it. He's a righteous guy. Acts chapter 10. Just read it and you'll see this has got to be his name. And they said, no way, no way. I said, well, I'm going to call him Cornelius. Even if you name him something different. And that didn't work out very good for me, but I've really tried. And so some of you out here, you're going to be like, one of these days, Brent's going to be rewarded for his efforts. You're going to name your kids Cornelius. Over the years, 20 years from now, there's going to be Corneliuses everywhere around here because of the inspiration of this moment right here. Cornelius, he's such a righteous guy. We just like him so much. But his story, it takes place over all of chapter 10, and it's we're not going to take all of chapter 10 on this morning. We're going to break it up over a couple of weeks. And you know how, like in some of your TV shows, every episode has its natural start and finish, but then every once in a while there's those specials where you get toward the end and you're like, oh, are they going to close the deal? Is this going to happen? And then it's to be continued. Well, this is one of those to be continued texts. We're not going to give the full story of what's happening in this it's just too much to take on this day. So we're going to just do the first 8 verses, and we're going to see that good isn't good enough, right? That's the title of the sermon. Good isn't good enough. But let's check this out. It says in chapter 10, starting in verse 1, at Caesarea, there was a man named Cornelius, a centurion of what was known as the Italian cohort, a devout man who feared God with all his household and gave alms generously to the people and prayed continually to God. About the 9th hour of the day, he saw clearly in a vision an angel of God coming in and saying to him, Cornelius. And he stared at him in terror and said, What is it, Lord? And he said to him, Your prayers and your alms have ascended as a memorial before God. And now send men to Joppa and bring one Simon who is called Peter. He's lodging with one Simon a tanner whose house is by the sea. When the angel who spoke to him had departed, he called 2 of his servants and a devout soldier from among those who attended him, and having related everything to them, he sent them to Joppa. So immediately we're introduced to this guy named Cornelius who's in Caesarea. Right? And the first things that we see, as we'll go through all 8 verses, but the first things we see in these first couple of verses is that Cornelius is a really good guy. I mean, when we read the description of him, we go, man, this guy, he's a really good guy. Now, let's make sure we're remembering, he's in Caesarea. We've heard of this place before. In Acts chapter 6, there was a man named Philip who was chosen along with 6 other people to take care of the widows who were being neglected as the church was growing in complexity. But Philip wasn't used just in that important way. He was used in other important ways, and he went about preaching the gospel. God took him to a road that went down from Jerusalem to Gaza to meet up with an Ethiopian eunuch, shares the gospel with him. This guy gives his heart to Christ, gets baptized, and then Philip finds himself in Azotus. Remember that? This is just a couple of weeks ago. And then from Azotus, he makes his way up through the various villages and towns until he came to Caesarea. Right? And so that's where the last we hear of Philip. So we know he's in Caesarea still, because in Acts 21, 20 years later, he's still there. So Philip's up in Caesarea. So this is where Cornelius is stationed. Right? So he's there. This town, Caesarea, is a seaport city. It's a very important city named after Augustus Caesar. It was they had a large Greek-speaking population there, and it was like 30 or so miles north of Joppa, which is where we left Peter last week. Peter was in Joppa after his encounter with Tabitha, and Joppa is, like I said, 30 miles south of Caesarea. So the equivalent, it would be like between Mount Vernon and Burlington. Mount Vernon and Bellingham, right? So about 30 or so miles. Now remember, these guys are on foot when they're traveling about. So that'd be a pretty good jaunt to go from Joppa to Caesarea. But that's what's taking place here. And we'll kind of put all that together in just a few moments. But the Roman government is seated, the Roman government over the province of Judea, which is kind of like a county, a region there. The Roman government is seated in Caesarea, and that's where Cornelius is as a centurion. We learned quite a bit about him just in these couple of verses. So as a centurion, now that means he is not just a warrior in the Roman army, he's not just a soldier, but he's a leader among those. So a centurion oversaw, believe it or not, a century of soldiers, about 100 soldiers. Right? And so the way the Roman government was organized, the Roman army was organized in that, is they had these breakdowns of groups of people. A century was 100 soldiers overseen by a centurion. These cohorts, of which Cornelius is a part of the Italian cohort, that was made up of 6 cohorts, so 600 soldiers overseen by a tribute. So Cornelius answers to a tribute. He's one of 6 centurions in this Italian cohort, and then the cohorts, 10 cohorts made up a legion, so 6,000 troops. You follow? Some of you are putting that together from some of the other biblical texts that talk about these things. But this is Cornelius. So he's a leader. These centurions were really kind of the backbone of the Roman army. And Polybius, who was a Greek historian, this is what he said about centurions. He said, they're required not to be bold and adventurous so much as good leaders, of steady and prudent mind, not prone to take the offense or start fighting wantonly, but able, when overwhelmed and hard-pressed, to stand fast and die at their post. Centurions were men, right? They were mighty men. They were strong, courageous, heroic men who served under authority. They were paid well. So they're usually men of means, and this is what we're going to see in just a little bit as we look at. So the first thing we see with Cornelius is that he's a warrior, he's a leader, right? And then we get in verse 2 this description of this guy where you just go, man, this dude is he's a really good person. So the first verse tells us kind of who he is as a man. Like we just get this sense that he's this stalwart of a guy. But then we see another side of him that's got a softness, tenderness to it. That there's something about Cornelius down deep in his core. He's not just a shell of a guy. He's not just a poser of a guy. He's like the real deal, right? He's an exemplary type guy. First thing we see is that he's a God-fearer, a devout man who feared God. And so that's actually like an official title in this day because of the Jewish influence and because the Jews worship the one true God whose name is Yahweh. Anybody who isn't a Jew is considered a Gentile. So in the Jewish mindset, there's two groups of people. There's Jews and then there's Gentiles. So if you're not a Jew, you're a Gentile. So probably the supermajority of us in here would be considered Gentiles. Cornelius is a Gentile, right? And he's called a God-fearer, and that's one of their kind of an official title in that a God-fearer was not a full proselyte. A full proselyte to Judaism would have undergone circumcision and kept the kosher food diets. But Cornelius hadn't done that, but he still honored the God of Israel, Yahweh, by worshiping him and by upholding the ethical and moral codes of Torah. Right? So the first 5 books of the Bible, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, that's known as Torah, the books of Moses. And so as a God-fearer, this guy, he was a student of the Bible. He tried to worship God appropriately. He tried to honor God with the way he lived his life, with his ethics, with his morals. All of those things tell us when it says that he was a God-fearer, right? He had a deep reverence for God. He was devoted to God. This is who he is. But we also see, next line, that he did this wasn't just like a personal thing. He didn't keep, if you will, his religion to himself. He had a strong influence in his family. He's not just leading his century of soldiers, he's also leading his family really well because he's doing this with all his household, right? And as we get later in next week and the week after, as we start to see the rest of his story, when remember, so Peter is being sent for here. When Peter shows up, Cornelius has not just his family together, but he's got his close friends together as well. So this guy's, and I don't even like to use the word religion because it has such a negative connotation in our culture today, but this guy's religion is not a private thing to him. This is something that he loves God. He is devoted to God, and he wants everybody around him to know the God that he knows. He wants everybody around him to have this reverence for God, this devotion to God. He's like the real deal, right? He's not a pretender. He's not a hypocrite. He's truly, seriously striving to be a really good person, right? You get it? Next thing we see about Cornelius is that it says he gave alms generously to all the people. Now, we saw that word last week in describing this widow, Tabitha, who had died, that she was super generous. She was giving alms. Bring that definition up again real quick. So, alms, the act of contributing money or goods to the poor, especially as flowing from a disposition of kindness and compassion. So Tabitha's this widow. Now, I don't know about you, but my little stereotypical view of a widow is somebody who is kind and compassionate. When I picture a widow, I just think of this of a woman who is just tender inside, like she has such a softness, such a caringness about her, and that she, like Tabitha, couldn't help but help people because it was just the way she was. But now we've got this guy, Cornelius, who's a warrior leader, and he's got the same sort of person, the same sort of personality or characteristics as Tabitha did, right? He is this devout man who's this warrior guy, and he gave alms generously to all the people, right? I mean, come on, this guy is a really good guy, right? You see it? he's paid well, which is great. Like, this is part of the deal, right? And so, but he doesn't just hoard it to himself. He's generous, which is always a mark of God's people. It's always a mark of God's people. They're generous people. That's the way it is. But he's a man of means, and so he gave generously to the people. And alms was to poor people. Alms was always about the poor. So people who are on the fringe, people who are, if you will, less fortunate, figure out whatever adjectives you want to use for people who don't have everything that other people have. And Cornelius has things, like he's a man of means, paid up to 5 times the average wage of a soldier. This guy he's a man of means, but he's also kind and compassionate. He's a guy who looks out for the less fortunate. He's a guy who can't let somebody who has a need, he can't let it go by. Like, it's hard for him to pass that up, right? And so he's like the real deal, this Cornelius. He has a reverence for God. He's caring toward the poor. This guy is serious. He's just such a good guy, isn't he? You feeling it? Are you feeling it? Like, we like Cornelius, right? You want to name your kids after this guy, don't you? You're like, totally, Cornelius is awesome. Last thing we're told about Cornelius is that he prayed continually to God. That seals the deal right there, right? Cornelius is a guy who knows of God's participation within his creation, and Cornelius knows that God is active in his own life and that he's dependent upon him. And so Cornelius is praying to God regularly. He's seeking God's guidance. He's asking for God's help and provision. He's confessing his trust and his dependence upon the one true God. Cornelius is an awesome guy. This guy is a really good guy. He's super impressive, huh? You feeling it? Like, he's a warrior, he's a leader, he fears God, he gives to people in need, he prays regularly. This guy's amazing. And here's what I see in the next passage as we get into verse 3 through 6 is not only could we say, as we just kind of look at his bio there in verses 1 and 2, that the next thing that we see is that God actually acknowledges that Cornelius is a really good guy. So it's not just like Luke, the human author, saying, hey, this guy Cornelius, he's a really good guy. In the next couple of verses, God is acknowledging that Cornelius is a really good guy. Look at him again. Look at verse 3. About the 9th hour of the day, he saw clearly a vision of an angel of God come in and say to him, Cornelius. And he stared at him in terror and said, what is it, Lord? And he said to him, your prayers and your alms have ascended as a memorial before God. And now send men to Joppa and bring one Simon, who's called Peter. He's lodging with one Simon, a tanner, whose house is by the sea. So, what do we see? This angel visits Cornelius at the 9th hour, which is what we would know it as 3 o'clock in the afternoon. This is an official hour of prayer for the Jewish people. So here we go. Cornelius is following this Jewish tradition. God-fearing man, kind of holds that official title. I'm a God-fearer, so I pray at the hour of prayer, 3 o'clock, or the 9th hour, right? So this is what he's doing. He's observing this formal hour of prayer. It's at this time that this angel appears to him, it says, in a vision. Now, it's a very biblical thing to have a vision. I mean, we saw this back in Acts chapter 2 when the Spirit of God was poured out. The prophecy from Joel is that in the last days I will pour out my Spirit upon all flesh, and your sons and your daughters will prophesy. People will see visions and dream dreams. It's something that was very, very biblical, and we see it throughout the book of Acts. Visions taking place. We saw this. So they're not always easy to understand. Bring up the definition of that. Let's bring that up here real quick. So a vision is a supernatural experience where a particular message is imparted. So there's a reason for somebody to have a vision. They're not always wonder what it means. You go, okay, that's good. You think it would just be super. Not all the time. Peter was confused. He was trying to figure out what the vision he saw meant. So that's one thing to think about. So the supernatural experience where a particular message is imparted, but sometimes you got to figure out what that message means. Sometimes it's very real. So when Jesus took his disciples up onto what we know as the Mount of Transfiguration, he took 3 disciples up there, and he was gloriously, he showed them his glory, right? And that was a vision, but it was very real. It wasn't like it was a dream. It was very real. But other visions in the Bible are much more dream-like. So when Ananias was told in a vision to be a part of Paul's conversion, as we saw from back in Acts chapter 9, that was very dream-like. This is more real life. Like there is actually an angel that appears to him. It's not a dream of an angel. It's actually an angel that appears to him, and we can kind of see that as we read through the rest of the text. But this is what's taking place here, right? So the angel tells Cornelius that God has kept a record of his goodness. So the angel shows up, and like I know in our world, because of Hallmark stores and stuff, we got a kind of a twisted, false view of what an angel looks like. They're typically these pudgy little things that they're kind of like the Pillsbury Doughboy, right? That's what they look like. That's what angels in our world look like. But I mean, remember, Cornelius is like this warrior guy, and he sees an angel and he's terrified. That's a strong word, right? So people that say, I saw an angel, and like they say, yeah, I had this conversation. I'm like, I'll bet you didn't see an actual angel, right? Because like Cornelius he's scared. He's scared his pants off him right here, right? Seriously. This is super, super serious, right? And so this angel shows up, and Cornelius is terrified, and this is then the angel's message. Your prayers and your alms have ascended as a memorial before God. God is acknowledging Cornelius' goodness. He's telling him, man, you've been a really good guy. I'm remembering that you've been a really good guy. This is sacrificial language. So this comes like this sort of language is ascended as a memorial. It comes from like Old Testament temple worship language. So in the Jewish temple worship, there were lots of different types of offerings, one of which was called a grain offering. And when the worshiper would bring the grain offering, part of it would go to like the priests and the Levites for their sustenance. And one part of it, the worshiper would actually take a portion of it, and he or she would burn it before the Lord. And it was said to rise. The smoke of it was said to rise as a memorial to God. And really it was a matter of the worshiper acknowledging that God is God and that he has provided everything for them. And the worshiper is saying, God, I recognize that everything that I have is from you, and I'm burning this portion, this memorial before you, part of this grain offering. I'm burning this before you to remind me that it all comes from you, and to remind you to bless me because I know it. That's kind of what's being communicated in that memorial. So when the angel says this to Cornelius, it's some of that same kind of language, kind of that same sentiment that the angel is saying, Cornelius, all the things that you've been doing, all of your praying, all of your almsgiving, all that generosity, your devoutness, God has not overlooked that. That's got his attention. God pays attention to those types of things, right? That's interesting, isn't it? Because some of you all of a sudden are going, whoa, wait a second. Where's the gospel in this? Because that's a works kind of a mentality, right? That's kind of like, wait a second, is Cornelius earning the favor of God by what he does? Well, let's stick with this. Let's see where this goes, right? Because God acknowledging Cornelius' goodness and his devotion, he's doing so to point out that it's insufficient. You say, wait a second, he's a really good guy and it's not enough? It's precisely. He's a super good guy. Like there's no faults that we could see to Cornelius, but we know he's human. So he has them. But we're given this picture of this really good guy to help us see that being really good isn't good enough, right? Let's stick with it, right? So the angel tells Cornelius what to do, because if all of his goodness and all of his devotion were enough, then the rest of the story doesn't make any sense at all. Right? So the angel's got to tell him what to do next, and here we see just this curious. I don't know if you're like me, I look at this and I go, God's ways are very curious. Right? So the angel says, here's what you got to do. You got to send men to Joppa. Men to Joppa, that's 30 miles away on foot. Right? Send men to Joppa, bring one Simon who's called Peter. He's lodging with one Simon, a tanner who's by the sea. Okay, send men to Joppa. You're like, wait a second. Philip, who's a Christian, who's a kind of an evangelist, he's in Caesarea. Why doesn't he just say, hey, right around the corner, just 2 blocks down, there's a guy named Philip. He could just walk right over and tell you. Right? But this is the curious ways of God. Right? For that matter, why, the angel could tell him what he wants him to hear. Why does God work like this? Why does he, like sometimes the closest distance between 2 points is not a straight line for God. Right? You're like, that's not the easiest way to do this. I could figure out a better way. I'm being facetious, right? You get that, right? But isn't that curious to you? Like, why does he do these things? I can think of 2 reasons, and there's probably plenty of other reasons, but the first one is this, the specificity of God's providence. That means bring up the definition, providence, God's active care, guidance, and preservation of his creation. Providence is a big line of study theologically, but that's a super brief definition of providence, that God actively cares for, guides, and preserves his creation. That he is not he's not a God removed, that he is very involved in life on planet Earth and life in this universe. That God is not a God far away, but he is a God near, right? He's actively involved. And there is a specificity to his providence, to his active care. In God's plan, he's always using people. But when God uses people, he's not using generic, vague people. He's using specific people for specific things, right? So God has something for Philip to do in Caesarea that he doesn't have for Peter to do in Caesarea. Peter's needed for a different reason, right? And so we see this, and I think that my hope is that you could see this even in your own life, that you have things to do for God that God doesn't have other people to do it in that way, right? There's a specificity to God's active care in your life, and that he has things for you to do that he hasn't asked other people to do. So that's the first thing that I see in this, is that God has something for Peter to do that really other people can't do, and that brings us to the second reason, and that is the gospel credibility. So the 2 reasons I see the curious ways of God here, first is the specificity of providence, and the second is gospel credibility. Now remember who Peter is. Peter isn't just one of the apostles. Like the apostles had an apostolic authority that no other humans have carried, right? The apostles were the ones who laid the foundation of the church. They were handpicked, chosen by Christ. They were authorized, anointed by Christ to do a specific thing that was very important, right? That's very, very critical. And so that apostolic authority is critical in laying the foundation of the church that we as a church are built on, right? Is the teachings of Jesus Christ as handed down to us through the apostles. So, but Peter's not just an apostle. He's like the first among the apostles. And what's going to happen here in Acts chapter 10 is the gospel is getting ready to bridge a gap that is so large, unless Peter's there to witness it, its credibility is going to be in question. Its credibility is going to be in jeopardy, right? Because of the way things were, and this is what we'll get to in the next couple of weeks, because of the way things were, the relationships between Jews and Gentiles, the gospel is now, remember, this is like the plan of Christ from Acts chapter 1, verse 8, that you'll be my witnesses in Jerusalem and Judea and Samaria and to the ends of the earth. Well, friends, when the gospel bridges this gap in Acts chapter 10, that's basically the fringe of the edge of the earth. That's it, right? This is the pattern of the book of Acts, and that leap from the Jewish heritage of Christianity over to the Gentile world, that leap is so great that unless the Apostle Peter is present to witness it, to verify it, to validate it, it's going to be held in question, right? So that's part of why God is doing what he's doing. But I think we can conclude that for this particular scene, but I would even challenge you. Sometimes you think, well, God's ways are curious, and so I don't know if I want to do it his way. Right? And you're like, I suppose it would be okay to question it, not to wonder about it, to be curious about it, but obedience is always the best answer, right? Obedience is always the best answer. I mean, we could go on about that. Never mind. I'll get sidetracked. So that brings us to our last couple of verses, right? So we've got Cornelius, this really good guy, and this is the testimony of his life, right? Here, a really good guy. And then on top of that, we've got God acknowledging that he's a really good guy. And now we move into our last couple of verses, and by Cornelius' response to the message of the angel, we see that Cornelius acknowledged that he needed God's salvation. That in all of his goodness, that in everything that he'd been doing, he still needed to be reconciled to God through Christ. So so he responds, and we see two things about Cornelius. One, that he understood authority, and two, that he understood himself. We're going to get to that. So when the angel who spoke to him had departed, he did exactly what he was told to do. He called 2 of his servants and a devout soldier from among those who had attended, and having related everything to them, he sent them to Joppa. So you say, well, wait a second. How do I make the connection that he knew he needed salvation? All right, so remember, these 8 verses aren't the whole story of Cornelius. So after everything takes place in Acts chapter 10, Peter shows up, all of those things that we'll get to in the next couple of weeks. When Peter gets back to Jerusalem, he's called to account because he had the audacity to go into the house of a Gentile, which was totally forbidden for Jewish people. So you see this big gap that we're talking about, right? So he has to give an account to these other people for having done that. Bring this verse up, Acts chapter 11. So Peter's retelling the story, and he says, and Cornelius told us how he had seen the angel stand in his house and say, send to Joppa and bring Simon, who is called Peter. Verse 14, he will declare to you a message by which you will be saved. So in Acts chapter 10, verses 1 through 8, we don't get the full story. And until we get that, then we reread the last 2 verses of our text today, and we go, oh, there it is, right? The angel says, send men to Joppa, and you will be told a message by which you must be saved. Right? So Cornelius does exactly what he's told to do. We get this additional information, and we understand where he's coming from. We understand that he understands authority. Remember, he is a man in authority, but he's also a man under authority. He answers to a tribute. He knows that when as a man under authority, when somebody in authority tells him to do something, he does it. He estimates that this angel is someone of authority. He's terrorized by him, right? He's terrified, I should say, by him. And when the angel says, do this because God sent me to you, he knows he's under authority. He does exactly what he's supposed to do, right? Being under authority is a mark of humility. It's a mark of wisdom. It's a mark of safety. To choose to live under that authority is wise. To choose to rebel against that authority is very unwise. God works through delegated authority, right? All authority belongs to God, and he works through delegated authority. So he delegates. We just acknowledge these parents who are to bring these children up in the ways of God, right? These parents are the authority in those kids' lives, right? That's delegated authority from God. So they have a solemn responsibility to carry out that authority, even if they don't feel like it. All of us do, right? God delegates authority to governments. God delegates authorities to pastors and elders in the church. God delegates authorities in lots of different ways and places of employment and all of that. And to be under authority is a wise thing, right? In fact, don't get too close to somebody who won't live under authority, because they're renegades, and at some point it's going to come back to bite them, and anybody that's too close to them will be in their wake. Right? Don't ever follow a leader who's not under authority. Right? At some point, their pride is going to turn them inward, and they're going to think they're a reigning monarch. and then there's just going to be this nasty wake behind him. Don't ever follow a leader that's not under authority. Right? You should be able to say, tell me how you're under authority. And if you don't get a clear answer, don't follow him. Right? It's not, you'll be in their wake at some point, regardless of their charisma. You could say amen if you want. So, but Cornelius, he's a guy, right? So, he's under authority, he understands this, but more than that, he understands himself. Like Cornelius this isn't an autobiography of him. This is a biography that Luke writes in these first couple of verses of what a great guy that he is. But Cornelius knew he was a good guy. Like he knew that doing these things honored God. He knew that it wasn't like a pride thing to him, but he recognized that I'm striving to live the way God desires me to live. Right? These are all very, very good things. And Cornelius, he was aware of that, but he also knew himself. Right? Humans have a strange mixture of good and evil residing within us. Like both forces run through our veins. Right? Now here's something kind of interesting. What are the odds? Just think about this. What are the odds that I would be preaching Acts chapter 10 about a man named Cornelius and quote from a book by a guy named Cornelius? Huh? This is so great. Cornelius Plantinga. Some of you have never heard of him before. Cornelius Plantinga. I'm reading a book called Not the Way It Is Supposed to Be. It's a breviary of sin. A breviary is a short theology, a summary theology of sin. And this book is rich. My goodness, it's pointed. And it's just this idea, as we see even from the life of Cornelius in Acts chapter 10, it's just this idea that as human beings, we're created in the image of God. And even though that image is marred and messed up because of sin, that image is still there. And so we still can live life with dignity and honor and do noble things. But all the while, there's still these forces inside of us that are just like ignoble. They're not honorable. And we do things that we shouldn't do and we wish we didn't do. And there's just this mixture. Both forces, good and evil, run through our veins, friends. Anybody that says that it's not true they're not being even honest with themselves, right? So, which is again why it's important to be under authority. That's an aside. But Cornelius Plantinga in this book, Not the Way It Is Supposed to Be, he gives a couple of, I won't list them all, but just a couple of really apt examples of the nobility and the ugliness of the human race, right? So the first person he lists is Martin Luther. Right? He's the big champion of grace that sparked the Reformation, right? 1518. This is a big thing, right? And yet this same man holds appalling anti-Semitic views. You're like, how is that? How can you be such a champion of grace and be prejudiced toward a certain race of people? It's appalling. Right? Then he lists Martin Luther King Jr., like most of us are familiar with him, right? The dignity and courage that this guy had to forcefully move the issues of civil rights forward in our society makes him rightly a hero of the 20th century. And yet his known adultery is a blight on his reputation and a mar, most definitely, against his cause. Like how could you be such a champion and so stupid at the same time? All due respect. Yeah. Listen to this. I was going to say, I'll need your full attention. But, so a little quote from this book, and just kind of give you a sense of how rich it is. Cornelius Plantinga. He says, except where a particular person has become a symbol of good and evil, rendering qualifying judgments trifling and perverse, our judgments of most everybody, including ourselves, are bound to be mixed. I'm going to read it again because I left out one parenthetical statement in here. He says, except where a particular person has become a symbol of good and evil, of good or evil, right? rendering qualifying judgments trifling or perverse. And this is what he said. So he says, we do not blame Mother Teresa for her small theological lapses. Why? Because she's become a symbol of good. So we're not going to parse her theology and become her critic. She's Mother Teresa, right? Anybody that wants to be a critic of Mother Teresa is a little bit off their rocker. Right? And he uses a far example from the other side as well. He says, neither do we praise Hitler because he shunned profanity. There's nothing admirable about the fact that Hitler wouldn't say swear words when he's willing to kill millions of people. So that's where he says, except where a particular person has become a symbol of good or evil, rendering qualifying judgments trifling and perverse. Our judgments of most everybody, including ourselves, are bound to be mixed. So here's Cornelius, this really great guy. And he's just a really great guy, right? He's a human being. Theologians call this pervasive depravity, where sin has saturated to the very core of who we are to the extent that everything we do is tainted. Right? Though created in the image of God, still bearing that noble image, we are sinners that cannot help but sin. Good is not good enough. And that's, friends, why there's such a thing as the gospel. That's why the news about Christ is called good news, because good is not good enough when it comes to humans. Our main idea is just this: Jesus came to save sinners, even really good ones. Right? All of us, friends. I mean, it doesn't take a genius to look at some people's lives and go, boy, they need Jesus. They need Jesus. Like, there are people that aren't even religious. They don't even believe in Jesus. And they look at some people's lives and they're like, that guy, that gal needs Jesus. But then we see people all around us who are really good guys, really good gals. They're striving to have a decent life, and they're good citizens, and they keep their grass cut, and they, pay their taxes, and they're just friends, they're pals, they're buddies, and you're like, yeah, Jesus came to save them too. Because good isn't good enough, friends. That no matter what, we could try to be just like Cornelius, and we're going to hear the same thing from God that Cornelius did. You need Jesus. You need Jesus. Right? You with me? Yeah. Our best efforts aren't enough. There's a point to the cross, and that's the fact that all of us have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. That all of us need to be reconciled to God, and that reconciliation only comes through Christ, not through our good efforts. So there's two ways that I would just encourage you to respond to this. To those of you who are not yet Christians, you would say, I'm not a follower of Christ. Admit that you need Jesus. He came, he died, he gave his life that you might be reconciled to God. Don't overlook that. Don't strive to do it in your own efforts. It'll never be enough. Your good is not good enough. Your best efforts will fall short all day long because you are sinful, and God, and that is an offense to God. That sin needs to be eradicated. God needs to forgive you of that, right? And that only happens through Christ. So for those of you that haven't received Christ, receive him. Put your faith and trust in him, right? Whether you're really bad or whether you're really good, it's not even the point. The point is you need Jesus, because your good isn't good enough, right? Not for any of us. For others who are Christians, I would say practice what Cornelius did. Be devout, right? Live your life in such a way that God is revered in the way you live and in your household. And be generous with your money, and be a person of prayer. Be all of those things. Do all of those things, but do them as an expression of your love for God in Christ, and not to try to attain the approval of God apart from Christ. Right? Those are all really good things that all Christians should practice, but not to earn the favor of God, but because you have the favor of God. All right, let's bow in prayer. Just a moment, I'm going to have the ushers come and help receive the offering and the connection cards. But I want to pray. Lord, thank you for your great grace, for your favor that is ours in Christ. And on this Mother's Day, on this day when we want to honor and recognize the nobility of motherhood and just give thanks to you and to all who are serving in this noble role. Lord, we bring our hearts and minds together just to bow before your throne. And I pray for those who are here who don't know of your great salvation. Maybe they've just been really bad. And I pray that they would receive Christ as Lord this day. Maybe they've strived to be really good. And I pray that they would receive Christ the Lord this day. Even at this moment, Lord, as you open hearts and minds to that good news that Jesus Christ came to save sinners, even really good ones. Lord, thank you for your good news. And I pray for your church, Lord, for those of us who are in Christ. Lord, may our motives be pure. May we serve you. May we do the things that we read about from Cornelius. Lord, may we do those things as a response to your grace and not as an attempt to earn it. Teach us your ways, good Lord. We love you and praise you, God. Thank you for your favor in our lives. And God bless the moms.